If you're a Christian, and in particular if you have an evangelical background, then the likelihood is that, like me, you've been taught over the years that you just can't be both gay and Christian. With me, it was actually a good few years before I began to register. I'd always been taught these things by very heterosexual church leaders. What I needed to do was to go out and hear from gay Christians themselves about their own beliefs and experiences, and about how these kinds of teachings stacked up for them in reality. What I heard from them made me decide that from then on, I was going to listen to all sides of any particular story and not just open myself up to one viewpoint. One of the people I heard from was Jeremy Marks. His story of wrestling with what he believed to be deep biblical truths had a huge impact on me. See what you think. Here's Jeremy. The site really is for people who are transitioning in their faith, and I know that you, when it comes to the compatibility or not of Christianity and homosexuality, you've had a few transitions.
Yes. Well, if I go back to the earliest period of first recognising I had feelings of attraction to the same sex in my teens, I was then negotiating a very hostile society that was very anti-homosexuality, and so I just didn't want to be gay at all. I wanted to be normal, and I thought maybe I had some mental illness. I didn't understand what the nature of sexuality was at all in my teens, and I just wanted to be normal. So
it hadn't long been illegal, had it?
No, in 1967 it was the law changed, and of course I would have been 15 at that point. But the society at that time was discussing the issue, as people do, because it was in the media a great deal, and I soon realised that people were very hostile. They thought homosexuality was something beneath contempt, really, and that none of us would know such people because they were just indecent and at odds with the law. And when the law changed, I don't think any of us really understood how the law could have changed, how we could allow such awful behaviour, what reason would there be for it. But I don't think most people's discussions progressed beyond that. And so I just wanted to be normal. But there was another aspect to all of this, is that my perception of God was that God was a very angry God who hated sin and absolutely hated homosexuality. So it was actually a terrifying place to be, because as I went to church on Sundays and heard about us miserable sinners that were, like worms, not a man, and not worthy to gather up the crumbs under God's table, kind of thing. Because of that, I felt I was in a very difficult position as I stood before God, because I didn't know why I had the feelings. I hadn't done anything wrong with them that I was aware of, except possibly thinking about it. And approaching such a hostile God was something that caused a great deal of fear and trauma in my life.
Well, you went on from there to a second stage where there seemed to be the possibility of sexually reorientating.
Yes, that was a long way ahead. Yes, that from sort of 1987 onwards, my experience with Love in Action was receiving a clear message that it would be possible to become heterosexual. And the idea was, as we understood it, that homosexuality was like a kind of interruption in our development. It's like going through an adolescent phase where one might have a crush on somebody of the same sex, but this had become eroticised inappropriately. But it was really to do with having a need for healthy same-sex bonding. A strong rationale behind this was the belief that somehow your relationship with your father had been inadequate, your father was absent or disinterested or even abusive in some cases, so that lack of a close father figure meant that you grew up with this hunger for male intimacy inappropriately met in a homosexual relationship, and that if one could only find the right kind of appropriate relationship, then one would grow through that period and grow out of it and naturally discover one's latent heterosexuality. That was the understanding we had, and it was a very appealing proposition. It seemed to tick all the boxes of giving us understanding of why we had these feelings and giving a possible answer as to how we might overcome them. And indeed, biblical characters like Jesus and John or David and Jonathan seemed to enjoy very intimate same-sex friendships, so that was a good model for us, and we wanted to pursue that.
Well, you founded Courage yourself, a Steps Out of Homosexuality
Yes.
program in the UK. So what really led up to that?
Well, the Steps Out of Homosexuality program was taken straight from the Love in Action program. They gave us permission to use it. And really and truly it was a basic discipleship program that any Christian would have benefited from, because an awful lot of it had nothing particularly to do with sexuality. It was to do with dealing with temptation, dealing with wrong attitudes, wrong beliefs and so on. And there were a few sessions in it looking at root causes such as fear and envy and isolation and other issues we thought were important. So we believed that if you just kept your walk with God really close and you absolutely shunned any kind of sinful thought patterns and certainly any sinful behaviour, that you would undoubtedly come through and become heterosexual. Because I think our understanding was that fundamentally homosexuality was a form of rebellion against God. It was a rebellion against his natural created order, and therefore we had to bring ourselves in line with what is right, how we had been created to be. So it was partly a discipleship issue and one of repentance and getting our thinking right, and partly doing this in an environment where we would have affirming family relationships that would enable us to be nourished emotionally.
You know, it must have been around that time that I was starting to ask myself questions about what I've been taught through the church about this kind of sphere of life. And I remember thinking at one time, you know, it's always heterosexual men at the front kind of declaiming against any sort of understanding and compatibility between homosexuality and Christianity. And in fact, I eventually decided, well, I'm going to go out and talk to some gay people. And to be honest, I was shattered, because as I began to ask them to tell me their own experiences from the inside, and these were Christian gay people, I came across countless stories of breakdown, of self-harm, of attempted suicide. I mean, did you experience at the end of this time that you actually did help people, or did you come across these kinds of stories yourself?
Oh, frequently I came across stories of people who were on the point of breakdown, or who had nervous breakdowns, and who were severely traumatised by the whole struggle. And I think I didn't see it then. In those days I thought to accept that we're sinners in God's sight and need to repent and need to get our lives right. It was just a matter-of-fact proposition that simply was basic Christian teaching. And it hadn't occurred to me then how deeply corrosive it was to think, if my feelings of love that happen to be directed towards another man are wicked and deviant, then that actually was extremely corrosive to my own sense of well-being. And that somehow I was supposed to find these feelings of love equivalent for somebody of the opposite sex, and not only find them, but wish to express them in the ultimate intimacy of sexual intercourse with someone of the opposite sex. I never thought through at that point what a huge leap this was requiring, because of the consciousness of the sinful nature of homosexuality as I saw it. You know, I just didn't go there. It was like supping with the devil, really, indulging one's own thinking. And on the positive side, all those people who had been very traumatised in their struggles did come to a real place of peace in coming to a community of other Christians who struggled with the same thing, because we were all in the same boat. Suddenly you're not alone anymore, and ending that isolation was a very significant step forward. The fact that we were all agreed that we had to resist this as a sinful kind of pattern was because we all came from the same evangelical backgrounds. I mean, we'd never have had anybody approach us for help who thought that homosexuality was okay. They all believed it was not, and wanted to find the answer and the way out, and we were journeying together.
Sure. Well, you went on after that, I believe, to become president of Exodus International Europe.
Yes.
I mean, did you find any more success stories out of your work with them?
Not really. I mean, there was a key chap who led a ministry in Holland who claimed to truly change his orientation and seemed to be happily married, a chap called Johan van der Sluis. Lovely man, actually, and in common with many Dutch people, he had a very brusque, matter-of-fact way of looking at life, and it was just a simple proposition of accepting what was right, and you do what's right and you eschew what's wrong. And I was completely convinced by it, and I adopted that way of thinking. In fact, he was very shocked when years later I said that I'd never really experienced any change at all, even though by that time I'd married, that I was really just accepting I could not act out homosexually, and therefore I tried to do the right thing, but didn't actually feel like doing that, as though there was a deep emotional change. But Apart from him, there were others who had married, but I would say their situations were very traumatic and difficult, actually. And so we were constantly meeting people who were very disturbed, deeply disturbed, I would say. And,
so, how would you sum up your experience of the fruits of how many years would that have been? 7, 8?
Yes, well, more like, well, certainly nearer 10 years, I would say. At least 10 years, because I started getting involved in Exodus in 87, late 87, and it wasn't until 97 that I'd begun to think I had some serious doubts about this. I think the doubts were growing, but I didn't articulate them because I thought of that as, again, being like the devil's influence trying to sway me away from being focused on the right Christ-like attitude. But I think the doubts were growing more and more because I was very unhappy indeed at what I saw happening in many people's lives. I mean, I just saw people giving up their faith completely. Not only there was no change at all in people's, not real change in terms of sexual orientation, I saw this deep, deep hopelessness creep in, and the kind of question in people's minds, well, I can't choose whether or not I'm gay, but I can choose whether or not I'm going to be a Christian. So if I can't be gay and Christian, I can't be a Christian.
So after 10 plus years of dedicated work in this sphere, commitment to people, to see them change, did you see any convincing change in anyone?
No, I never saw any convincing change at all. And of course by this time I'd been married myself for about 7 years, and I knew I hadn't changed. You know, I could be a kind and nice and respectful and loving husband, and we could enjoy the companionship that marriage offers, but there was no change in my sexual orientation at all. And again, my way of dealing with it was to shut down my homosexual feelings altogether, and I guess I vicariously got some value out of working with homosexual people because I knew I was working in an environment where people understood, and where again we were all committed to the right way of handling it as we saw it. But I didn't see any change. I saw one or two people get married because they just could not cope with the extreme hostility from their parents or their churches, and they just felt this is a more peaceful place to be married. I then seemed to be normal, and there are lots of plus points about being in a heterosexual world. You suddenly find all sorts of avenues for friendship with other couples and families open up, and you're seen as normal, and there's lots of perks, if you like, to being seen to be normal.